welcome to the research desk. I want to take you back to a spring afternoon in 1955.
Okay, setting the scene.
Exactly. Picture a 27-year-old graduate student. His name is Harry Markowitz. And he is walking into a seminar room at the University of Chicago to defend his PhD dissertation.
Which I have to imagine is a pretty intimidating room to walk into in 1955.
Oh, it's terrifying. He's sitting across this heavy wooden table from literal giants of economics. You've got Milton Friedman sitting there, who is, arguably the most formidable analytical mind of the century.
Right.
Jacob Marshak is there. He's the committee chair. Leonard Savage is there. I mean, these are men who routinely demolish the theoretical arguments of their peers just for sport.
Just for fun. And here comes this 27-year-old kid.
Exactly. And Markowitz had spent the last 4 years writing about something that, virtually no one else in the economics department considered to be a serious, rigorous academic question.
What was it?
He was trying to figure out, mathematically, how an investor should decide what mix of stocks to hold.
Which sounds so basic to us now.
It does. But back then, the tension in a room like that is just difficult to overstate. A PhD defense is not some polite conversation. It's an intellectual trial by fire.
Yeah, they probe every single weakness, every logical leap.
Right. And Markowitz is bringing them a topic that looked suspiciously like the kind of, lowbrow arithmetic you would find in a local bank manager's handbook. It did not belong in the halls of theoretical economics.
So how did they react?
Well, a few minutes into the defense, Friedman leans back in his chair and he delivers this line that just becomes permanent academic folklore. He looks across the table at Markowitz and says, he's read the dissertation thoroughly, and he concedes that he can find absolutely no mistakes in the mathematics.
Okay, that's a good start.
You would think. But then Friedman declares there is a fundamental, insurmountable problem. He says, this is not a dissertation in economics. Therefore, the University of Chicago cannot grant a PhD in economics.
Oh, wow. He just rejects the whole premise.
Completely. Friedman presses the issue. He says, it isn't mathematics either, and it isn't business administration. And then Marshak, maybe trying to break the tension, or honestly maybe just making it worse, he helpfully chimes in that it certainly wasn't literature.
That is brutal. I mean, Markowitz must have been panicking.
He was entirely unsure if his career was just over before it even began. They sent him out into this cold hallway to sweat while the committee deliberates.
Standing in a hallway waiting to find out if your life's work has been rejected on a categorical technicality. That is agonizing.
It really is. But the punchline of this story is what makes it so critical to our understanding of modern finance. Because 5 minutes later, Marshak opens the door and offers his congratulations.
Wait, what?
Yeah. The entire critique, that whole terrifying teardown, it had been a high-minded, terrifying half-joke.
A joke? That is a terrible joke to play on a grad student.
Economist, right? But Friedman's half-joke actually contained a really profound, buried truth. The framework that Markowitz had invented was so utterly unprecedented that the University of Chicago didn't even have a name for it yet.
It just didn't fit into any existing bucket.
Right. He had written a foundational text for a discipline that simply did not exist. 35 years later, the Nobel Committee would officially recognize that exact discipline under the new name, financial economics. And they'd award Harry Markowitz the prize for basically single-handedly creating it.
That is incredible. So the question we really need to answer here is, how did a 25-year-old student, because he started this a couple years before the defense, sitting in a Chicago library in the early 1950s, discover the single idea in all of finance that essentially gives you something for nothing?
That is exactly the central question.
Because when we look at wealth management today, it is massive. It's highly quantitative, deeply rigorous, totally dominated by algorithms. But you're saying that entire multi-trillion-dollar edifice is built directly on this one realization Markowitz had in a library?
I am. Today, we are going to unpack the specific theoretical breakthrough that built the modern index fund, the 401k balanced fund, and virtually every massive institutional strategy used today. We're going to prove exactly why diversification is widely considered the only true free lunch in investing.
I'm ready. Where do we start?
To grasp the magnitude of what he achieved, we have to reconstruct the curiously empty landscape of academic finance before 1952.
Curiously empty.
Yeah, I mean, if you asked a prestigious professor of economics in 1950 how a retail investor should choose which stocks to buy, you would get a surprisingly unscientific, almost dismissive answer. Finance back then was merely an empirical craft.
Like a trade, almost.
Exactly. It was this sprawling collection of rules of thumb passed down by Wall Street traders and trust officers. It was completely devoid of any unifying mathematical proof. Analysts just spent their time poring over train schedules, checking steel production quotas, reading balance sheets.
So there was no underlying theory tying it all together.
Well, the highest level of academic rigor available at the time belonged to a man named John Burr Williams. He had proposed something called the dividend discounting model.
Okay, we need to define that. Let's break down dividend discounting and this idea of expected return.
Sure. Let's use a simple analogy. Think of a magical goose.
A magical goose. I like where this is going.
Right. So if someone comes up to you and offers to sell you a magical goose that lays golden eggs, how do you decide what a fair price is to pay for it?
Well, I guess I'd want to know how many eggs it's going to lay.
Exactly. The logical answer is that the price of the goose should be the exact mathematical sum of all the golden eggs that goose will ever lay over its entire lifetime.
Makes sense.
Now, you would discount the value of the eggs you won't get for 20 years, right? Because you have to wait for them. And a golden egg today is worth more to you than a golden egg 2 decades from now. But ultimately, the value of the goose is just the present value of all its future eggs.
And Williams argued that a stock is basically just a magical goose.
Precisely. Williams said, a stock is no different. The right price for a share of a corporation was just the present value of all the dividends it would ever pay out into the future. That was your expected return.
Okay, so under Williams's model, the goal of a rational investor is incredibly straightforward. You calculate the present value of the future dividends for every stock, you compare that to the current market price, and you just buy the stock that offers the highest expected return.
That was the theory. But any smart outsider looking at the stock market in 1950 would see the massive glaring flaw in that logic.
Right, because if we follow that theory to its absolute mathematical conclusion, it creates a total behavioral absurdity.
Tell me why.
Well, if investors truly only care about the highest expected payout, finding the single goose that lays the absolute most golden eggs, then the math dictates you should put 100% of your money into the single best stock available.
Yes.
Like if stock A has an expected return of 10% and stock B has an expected return of 9.9%, the rational investor doesn't split their money. They put every single penny they have into stock A.
Exactly. And the glaring problem is nobody actually behaves that way.
Right. Even in the 1950s, grandmothers historically held risk-free government savings bonds right alongside a few reliable blue-chip stocks. Wealthy families preserve their fortunes by holding farmland, railroad stock, bank shares, and foreign bonds simultaneously. No rational human actually puts all their money into one single asset.
And that reveals the blind spot. The academic theory of the day demanded a behavior that no actual human being engaged in, because high expected dividends do not guarantee actual future payouts.
Because things go wrong.
Exactly. Bankruptcies happen, management embezzles funds, recessions wipe out entire industries overnight. The world is fundamentally uncertain, and real investors knew this intuitively. They relied on that ancient folk wisdom, right? Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Sure, but folk wisdom is comforting. It's analytically useless. Don't put all your eggs in one basket does not tell you how many baskets you actually need.
Right.
It doesn't tell you what kind of baskets to use, like do you use wicker baskets or steel baskets? Most importantly, it doesn't tell you if adding 100th basket gives you any more mathematical safety than holding just 10 baskets.
That is the exact gap Markowitz saw. Sitting in that library, reading Williams's book on dividend discounting, he realized that if investors are actively avoiding putting all their money into the single highest returning stock, they must be intentionally optimizing for a second variable alongside expected return.
And that second variable was risk.
Yes,
Investors were willingly giving up the maximum possible return just to buy a measure of safety. So the monumental task Markowitz set for himself was to give risk a strict mathematical number, just like Williams had given a strict mathematical number to expected return.
So how did he do it? Because quantifying fear and uncertainty sounds impossible.
Well, the core conceptual shift in Markowitz's thinking is honestly the pivot point of all modern finance. He determined that risk is not a property of a single stock. Risk is a property of the whole portfolio.
Let's define exactly what a portfolio is before we move further, just so we are completely clear.
Sure. Think of a portfolio as a carpenter's toolbox. The true value of a toolbox does not come from having a massive pile of hammers.
Even if the hammer is objectively the most efficient tool for driving nails.
Right. Because if you suddenly encounter a screw, or a pipe, or a bolt, your pile of hammers is totally useless. The value of the toolbox comes from having different tools for different jobs. A wrench, a screwdriver, a drill, working together as an aggregate unit to handle any unpredictable situation the carpenter might face on a job site.
Okay, I like that. So the toolbox is the portfolio. But before Markowitz came along, if financial analysts looked at risk at all, they looked strictly at volatility or variance.
Yes, and we need to define variance conceptually too. Variance measures how much a single stock swings up and down on its own over time.
Let's use an analogy for that.
Imagine a single boat bobbing wildly on a rough, unpredictable sea. Sometimes it rides really high on a massive crest, and sometimes it plunges deep into a terrifying trough. That violent individual movement, that is variance.
And the academic establishment and Wall Street thought of risk solely in terms of evaluating that single boat.
Exactly. They asked, how volatile is this one boat? But Markowitz realized that looking at the single boat in isolation was entirely the wrong approach.
So what is the right approach?
To illustrate his breakthrough, let's use a master analogy that I think perfectly captures Markowitz's insight. Imagine a town with highly unpredictable weather. And in this town, there are two highly volatile companies.
Okay.
The first company manufactures umbrellas. This company's profits absolutely soar when it rains for weeks on end, but its stock price crashes into the ground when the sun comes out and stays out.
Makes sense.
The second company manufactures sunscreen. Its profits skyrocket during brutal heat waves and sunny weather, but the stock crashes violently during the rainy season.
Now, as an old-school, pre-1952 investor reading the balance sheets of those two companies, I would evaluate them completely separately.
Right, you'd look at the single boats.
Exactly. I would look at the umbrella maker and say, well, this stock swings wildly from year to year based on unpredictable rain patterns. It has massive variance. And then I would look at the sunscreen maker and conclude the exact same thing.
You'd see two terribly risky investments.
Yeah, both are incredibly dangerous, highly volatile investments on their own. I want stability. I want, a steady railroad stock or something. I would never buy an unpredictable umbrella stock, and I'd never buy a highly volatile sunscreen stock.
And that isolated view of variance completely ignores the magic of what Markowitz called covariance.
Covariance, that's a technical term.
Yes. Covariance is the critical mathematical mechanism he identified. Covariance measures how two assets move in relation to one another.
Give me a visual for that.
Think of two dancers moving quickly across the stage. If you watch just one dancer, their individual movements might look really erratic, darting left and right.
Like the single boat.
Exactly. But if you watch them together, moving in perfectly opposite directions while holding hands, their individual movements actually offset. They keep their shared center of gravity perfectly still, even while their individual bodies are in constant violent motion.
So how does that apply to the umbrellas and the sunscreen?
When you buy both the umbrella stock and the sunscreen stock, and you put them both in your toolbox, you alter the fundamental physics of your risk.
Because they react oppositely to the exact same event.
Right. In the rainy season, the umbrella stock surges in value, while the sunscreen stock tanks. In the sunny season, the sunscreen stock surges while the umbrella stock tanks. Because they have what mathematicians call a strong negative covariance. Their violent, individual fluctuations cancel each other out perfectly.
So the total dollar value of your combined portfolio remains perfectly stable and smoothly growing, completely regardless of the unpredictable weather.
Yes. You have taken two highly risky, incredibly volatile assets and combined them to form a virtually risk-free bundle.
Which is huge, because in the rigorous world of finance, there's this ironclad law that everything costs something.
No free lunch.
Right. If you want higher returns, you are required to take on higher risk. If you want specialized management, you are required to pay higher fees. There is no such thing as a free lunch. But you're telling me Markowitz mathematically proved that holding the umbrella and the sunscreen lowers your total risk absolutely for free?
Yes. You do not pay a penalty in expected return to achieve that safety. That's the genius of it.
Okay, but let me push back here. The umbrella and sunscreen perfectly offset because weather is a binary system in our simple analogy. It is either raining or it is sunny.
Fair point.
But the real stock market is not a binary weather system. The New York Stock Exchange has thousands of complex, multinational companies operating across hundreds of different industries. How do you actually calculate this mathematical miracle when you have 2,000 companies instead of 2?
That is the exact problem Markowitz had to solve. He had to figure out how to transition from a nice theoretical metaphor about weather to a scalable mathematical machine. To make this insight operational across thousands of stocks, he had to build a rigid framework.
So what does that machine look like?
Well, imagine mapping every single stock on the exchange. For every individual stock, you must calculate its expected return, meaning how much money you think it will make. Then you must calculate its individual variance, meaning how wildly you expect it to swing on its own.
Which sounds tedious but doable.
But the heavy lifting comes with the covariance. You must calculate the covariance for every single possible pair of stocks in that massive universe.
Wait, every single pair?
Yes. The mathematics of portfolio variance dictate that the total risk of your toolbox is not simply an average of the individual risks of the tools inside it. The formula for portfolio variance includes every single pairwise covariance, mathematically weighted by how much of your money is in each specific stock.
1952 is staggering to even consider. If you have a universe of 2,000 stocks, you are looking at nearly 2 million unique pairs of covariances that must be calculated.
Close to 2 million, yes.
You have to meticulously map how General Motors stock moves relative to U.S. Steel, and then how General Motors moves relative to some small regional bank in Ohio, and then how that bank moves relative to a national railroad, and how that railroad moves relative to a mining operation in South America.
All of them.
Doing this on the computers of the early 1950s, I mean, we're talking about machines utilizing vacuum tubes that took up entire rooms and were vastly less powerful than the microchip inside a modern musical greeting card. That seems practically impossible. The data collection alone would require armies of clerks.
It was an immense logistical challenge, obviously, but the underlying math allowed Markowitz to visualize a concept that had never existed before in human history. He called it the efficient frontier.
The efficient frontier. Okay, we need to define that conceptually, because we can't show people the raw algebra. We need a visual intuition for this.
Absolutely. Imagine walking into a room and looking at a massive graph painted on the wall.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
The floor, the horizontal axis, represents risk. As you walk further to the right along the floor, the risk increases. The wall, the vertical axis, represents expected return. As you look higher up the wall, the potential profit increases.
Got it. Risk on the floor, return on the wall.
Now, if you calculate the expected return and the total portfolio variance for every single possible combination of those 2,000 stocks, and you plot every single one of those millions of hypothetical portfolios as a tiny dot on this massive graph, something incredible happens.
What happens?
They do not just form a random, messy cloud of dots. The dots actually hit a limit. They form a hard physical boundary line.
A boundary line.
Yes, it's a sweeping curve that arches upward and to the right. That curve is the efficient frontier. Markowitz discovered that the goal of every single rational investor on Earth is to place their money on a portfolio that sits exactly on the edge of that curve.
Why exactly on the edge? What happens if my portfolio dot sits inside the curve?
If you build a portfolio and plot its dot, and that dot sits anywhere inside the curve, meaning closer to the floor and away from the top left edge, it means you are making a verifiable mathematical error.
An error how?
Because a dot inside the curve means there is another portfolio straight above it that offers more return for the exact same amount of risk. Or there is another portfolio directly to its left that offers the exact same return but with significantly less risk.
Ah,
So being inside the curve means you are taking on extra danger for absolutely no reason, or you are leaving money on the table out of sheer mathematical ignorance.
okay, that makes perfect visual sense. You want to be pushed as far up and as far left as mathematically possible.
Yes, and the delicate balancing act Markowitz engineered to find the exact edge of that curve is known as mean variance optimization.
Mean variance optimization.
Right. The mean represents the expected return you desire, going up the wall. And the variance represents the risk you are trying to minimize, moving left along the floor.
So the magic of this efficient frontier curve is that you can approach this mathematical machine, input your exact personal psychological tolerance for risk, and it spits out a singular, precise, mathematically optimal answer.
Exactly. Let's say you are a nervous 65-year-old retiree. You absolutely cannot afford to lose the capital you need for living expenses. You point to a spot very low on the risk floor. The machine runs the mean variance optimization and tells you the exact mix of assets, maybe 70% bonds, 20% utility stocks, and 10% cash that provides the highest theoretically possible return for your specific low-risk coordinate.
But if you are a 30-year-old professional with decades to weather market crashes, you point to a spot way high on the risk floor.
Right, and the machine gives you a completely different, highly aggressive mix of volatile equities perfectly calibrated to maximize your long-term growth while still squeezing out every free ounce of covariance protection possible.
How did he actually solve the math to find that exact right mix? Because mainstream economics simply didn't have the mathematical tools to solve multivariable optimization problems of this staggering scale in the early 1950s.
You're right, they didn't. This is actually a fascinating story of smuggled science. Markowitz had to quietly look outside his own field of economics. He borrowed a discipline called operations research.
Operations research. I know this was used heavily in World War II.
Exactly. It was an applied, highly pragmatic branch of mathematics developed under intense pressure during the war. The military faced massive logistical puzzles. They had to figure out how to route convoys of merchant ships across the Atlantic to avoid German U-boats.
Right, because some ships were fast, some were slow, some carried vital aviation fuel, others carried bulk food supplies.
And the U-boats represented the deadly variance. The military had to calculate the optimal mix of ships, speeds, and routes to maximize the total amount of cargo arriving safely in Britain while simultaneously minimizing the total risk of the convoy being sunk.
And Markowitz looked at a stock market portfolio and realized it was conceptually identical to a wartime naval convoy.
It's the exact same math. Instead of optimizing the mix of fuel ships and food ships to avoid U-boats, he was optimizing the mix of General Electric and U.S. Steel to avoid market crashes.
To solve this convoy problem for stocks, he utilized a specific mathematical technique, right? Quadratic programming.
Yes, and we need to define quadratic programming conceptually.
Let's do it.
Imagine you are attempting to pack a large suitcase for a really long trip. But every single item you place in the suitcase is made of a bizarre reactive material that physically changes its shape depending on what other item it is touching.
Okay, that's weird, but I'm following.
If you pack your shoes next to your jacket, the shoes suddenly expand. If you move the shoes next to your books, the books shrink.
And you have a limited amount of space.
Right. You need to find the exact perfect configuration where every item rests smoothly and the suitcase closes perfectly. That is precisely what quadratic programming does with covariance.
Because changing the amount of one stock changes the risk profile of the entire bag.
Exactly. It iteratively adjusts the percentage weight of every single stock in your portfolio simultaneously. It constantly recalculates how a slight increase in the umbrella stock alters the necessary weight of the sunscreen stock, taking into account how both of them react to every single other stock in the universe until the algorithm settles on the singular configuration of minimum possible risk.
I mean, the mathematical architecture is flawless. The theoretical proof is beautiful. It is very easy to see why the Nobel Committee eventually recognized it.
It's elegant.
It is elegant, but I have to stop the celebration here. Academic praise always feels a bit too clean in retrospect. History, human behavior, financial markets, they are deeply, intensely messy.
They are.
So if this mean variance optimizer is a perfect machine that mathematically guarantees the safest path to wealth, why isn't everyone who uses it flawlessly rich? Where does this beautiful theory actually smash into the wall of reality?
That skepticism is entirely warranted. And this brings us to the wall. Because Markowitz's machine, the mean variance optimizer, is ultimately an engine, and like any engine, it cannot run on empty.
It needs data.
It requires specific, highly precise inputs to function. The required inputs for the quadratic programming to work are the expected return for every stock, the variance for every stock, and those millions of pairwise covariances.
And the insurmountable problem there is that we do not have a crystal ball.
Right. We cannot see the future. The only way to generate those necessary inputs is to look backward at historical data. We are forced to assume that exactly how the umbrella and sunscreen stocks behaved in relation to each other over the past 10 years is exactly how they will behave over the next 10 years.
Which brings us directly to the first major structural breakdown of the theory. This was articulated brilliantly in a 1989 paper published in the Financial Analyst Journal by Richard Michaud. The paper was titled The Markowitz Optimization Enigma.
Yes, Michaud's critique is legendary.
Michaud demonstrated mathematically that the Markowitz optimizer, rather than being a perfect shield, is actually an error maximizer.
Let's analyze the mechanics of that. Why is it an error maximizer?
Because when you feed massive amounts of historical data into a computer algorithm, that data is never pure. It is filled with tiny, random statistical anomalies and noise.
Right.
Suppose the historical data you feed into the machine makes a specific mid-cap technology stock look slightly better than it actually is in reality. Maybe a random series of lucky earnings reports gave it a fraction of a % higher expected return in your 10-year dataset.
And the Markowitz machine does not have human intuition.
Exactly. It does not look at that tech stock and say, that historical return seems a bit artificially high. I should probably smooth that out. The machine is rigidly literal.
It looks at the massive universe of stocks, identifies that slight statistical edge, and it just loads up on it aggressively. It maximizes the error.
The quadratic programming will spit out a recommendation for a wildly concentrated portfolio. It might tell you to put 40% of your entire net worth into that one obscure technology stock, simply because the blind math chased a flawed input to its absolute logical extreme.
Small, inevitable errors in historical data create dangerously unbalanced, highly concentrated portfolios that shatter the very premise of the diversification the machine was built to achieve.
It's completely counterproductive. And that devastating analysis leads to a really humbling reality in modern quantitative finance. It's a phenomenon often referred to as the 1N reality check.
Explain 1N.
When researchers test the highly sophisticated, computationally massive Markowitz optimization in out-of-sample environments, meaning they test it on future data the machine hasn't seen before, the Nobel-winning algorithm frequently loses to a brutally simple strategy, the 1N portfolio.
Which is just equal weighting.
Right. The 1N strategy requires 0 supercomputers. It simply means taking your total capital and dividing it equally among every available asset. If you are choosing among 100 stocks, you put exactly 1% of your money in each. N represents the number of stocks, and you divide by N.
So the brilliant complex optimization rule routinely gets beaten by the most naive rudimentary rule imaginable.
It loses because the perfect, pristine, error-free data required to feed Markowitz's theory simply does not exist outside of a textbook.
That error maximizer is the first wall. But the second wall is even more structurally profound, and it involves the terrifying breakdown of the core concept of covariance itself.
Due to fat tails.
Yes, a statistical phenomenon called fat tails. So Markowitz built his mathematics on the assumption that stock market returns are distributed normally.
Meaning a classic bell curve.
Right. In a standard normal distribution, a bell curve, most days the market is up a little or down a little. Extreme events, massive face-ripping surges, or catastrophic, terrifying crashes sit at the very thin ends of the bell curve. Mathematically, they are supposed to be incredibly rare.
But we know from bitter historical experience that the real stock market does not follow a clean, polite bell curve.
Not at all. Financial markets have fat tails. We need to define fat tails conceptually. Think of a normal distribution like a civil engineer predicting that a massive, devastating 100-year flood will only happen once every century. You build your city's levees based on that math.
Okay.
A fat tail environment is one where you build those levees and then that catastrophic 100-year flood suddenly happens 3 times in a single decade. The extreme events are vastly more common and more severe than the pure math predicts.
And the presence of fat tails destroys the protective power of covariance exactly at the moment you need it most desperately.
Exactly. The entire premise of our umbrella and sunscreen analogy is that the assets move in reliably opposite directions, cushioning your fall. But in a severe fat tail market panic, human psychology takes over.
Liquidity dries up. Pure panic is entirely contagious across all asset classes.
Look at the 2008 global financial crisis as the perfect, brutal illustration of fat tails shattering the efficient frontier. In 2008, high-yield corporate bonds plummeted, domestic equities plummeted, emerging market debt plummeted, real estate investment trusts plummeted, commodities plummeted.
Everything.
Everything. The carefully calculated historical covariances that the mean variance optimizers predicted would be negative suddenly all converged to 1. Everything crashed simultaneously in lockstep.
In the midst of that devastating storm, the umbrellas and the sunscreen suddenly became the exact same useless asset. Investors who thought they were perfectly positioned on the efficient frontier watched the structural protection of their portfolios just evaporate into thin air. Because in a true liquidity crisis, the only correlation that matters is the universal rush to cash.
It is terrifying when it happens. And there is actually a third wall that limits the pure theory too. Markowitz's original 1952 model relies on static assumptions.
Meaning time doesn't exist in the model.
Right. It operates mathematically as if you can run the quadratic programming on a computer once, buy the optimally weighted portfolio it recommends, and simply walk away forever, letting the math protect you indefinitely.
Which ignores the fact that real investing is overwhelmingly dynamic. You cannot set a portfolio and forget it, because moving money in the real world involves relentless, grinding friction.
Friction like taxes.
Exactly. The model ignores taxes. If a stock surges and you need to sell it to maintain your risk profile, you have to pay capital gains taxes, which immediately drains money from the portfolio. There are transaction costs, bid-ask spreads, and broker fees every single time you execute a trade to adjust your holdings.
Plus, the covariance between companies shifts over time as entire industries evolve or die.
Right. A static mathematical model simply cannot survive the dynamic friction of reality without constant, expensive manual maintenance.
Now, to be fair, Markowitz himself fully understood these limitations. He didn't just stop his work and declare the problem permanently solved in 1952. The subsequent 70 years of academic finance and Wall Street engineering have been largely devoted to building complex patches to fix the vulnerabilities in his engine.
Like what?
Scholars develop things called shrinkage estimators. These are mathematical tools designed to artificially tone down the error maximizer problem by basically forcing the algorithm to be less aggressive. Firms built Black-Litterman models to mathematically blend the subjective intuition of human portfolio managers with the rigid output of the optimizer. They have spent lifetimes trying to make the theory survive reality.
Okay, but if the pure, beautiful math breaks down in the real world due to bad historical data, and fat-tailed market crashes, and the relentless friction of transaction costs, what do we actually do with it?
Are you asking if we should abandon it?
Sort of, yeah. I mean, how does this towering theoretical architecture apply to an ordinary person trying to manage their 401k or preserve their life savings?
You do not abandon it. Because the reality is that the scaffolding Markowitz designed is silently running in the background of almost every single modern financial product you interact with today.
Give me an example.
The most pervasive, globally dominant example of this is the ubiquitous index fund. To grasp why index funds exist, we must define the concept of the market portfolio.
Okay, the market portfolio.
The market portfolio is a grand theoretical construct. Imagine a portfolio that holds a perfectly proportionate slice of every single investable financial asset in the world. Every stock, every bond, every piece of real estate.
So owning a fraction of everything.
Exactly. Buying the entire market is simply the ultimate, absolute extension of the efficient frontier. You are capturing the aggregate growth of human economic endeavor while diversifying away every piece of idiosyncratic risk possible.
So when you buy a humble Vanguard S&P 500 index fund, you are essentially buying a highly efficient proxy for that theoretical market portfolio.
Precisely. And here we must introduce the concept of beta. Beta is simply a measure of how much an individual stock moves relative to the entire market. If the market goes up 1% and your stock goes up exactly 1%, its beta is 1.
So by buying the entire index, you are basically locking your beta to the market.
You are receiving the mathematical benefit of mass diversification across 500 of the largest companies on Earth without ever having to calculate a single covariance matrix or pay a mathematician an exorbitant fee to run a quadratic programming optimizer.
The invisible hand of Markowitz also guides the classic 60-40 portfolio, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
The standard, decades-old institutional advice of holding 60% of your money in equities and 40% in bonds. That split is not just a random arbitrary rule of thumb drawn out of a hat.
No, it's very deliberate. It is a very specific median point carefully plotted on the Markowitz efficient frontier curve. It's empirically designed to capture a heavy portion of equity growth while utilizing the generally negative covariance of bonds to dampen the violent variance of the stocks.
It's the umbrella and the sunscreen again, just writ large.
Yes, and consider the target date funds that automatically enroll millions of workers in their corporate 401k plans. These funds are nothing more than automated sliders mechanically moving along the efficient frontier over time.
Meaning they adjust your risk as you age.
Right. When you are 30 years old, the fund algorithm positions your money at the high-risk, high-return edge of the curve, heavily weighted in volatile global equities. As you age and approach retirement, the algorithm slowly, mechanically slides your allocation down the curve toward the safe edge. It systematically sells equities and increases your bond holdings so that by age 65, your variance is minimized.
You never see the underlying math, but Markowitz's theory is actively guiding your retirement trajectory.
Completely. And we see even more advanced, highly engineered applications of his theories in the realm of massive institutional finance. Take the strategy of risk parity.
Risk parity. This was famously championed and implemented by Ray Dalio at the hedge fund Bridgewater Associates.
Let's define risk parity conceptually, because it directly addresses the flaws we talked about earlier. We discussed how the traditional Markowitz model is dangerously sensitive to flawed expected return estimates, turning it into an error maximizer. Risk parity attempts to completely bypass that catastrophic flaw.
How?
Instead of allocating your money based on the dollar amount, a risk parity strategy requires you to equal weight the actual mathematical variance each asset brings to the table.
So you're balancing the risk, not the money.
Precisely. You intentionally ignore the highly volatile, heavily flawed expected return estimates entirely. You focus solely on balancing the risk. If historical data shows that equities are highly volatile and bonds are very stable, a risk parity portfolio will hold a massive, sometimes leveraged, dollar amount of bonds and a much smaller dollar amount of equities.
The goal is to ensure that both asset classes contribute the exact same amount of mathematical risk to the total portfolio. You're balancing the volatility rather than balancing the dollars.
It's a brilliant evolution of the theory, and the legacy of Markowitz is also the driving engine behind modern retail financial technology, specifically robo-advisors like Betterment and Wealthfront.
Right, these platforms run highly modified, friction-adjusted Markowitz optimizations in the cloud every single night for millions of individual accounts.
And a critical automated mechanism they use to maintain your position on the curve is rebalancing. Let us define rebalancing with an everyday analogy.
Okay.
Imagine you have planted a beautifully designed garden with several different types of plants. You carefully mapped out the exact ratio of space for the hedges and the flowers to create a perfect visual harmony.
Nice and orderly.
But over the summer, the fast-growing hedges shoot up aggressively. They begin to encroach on the soil and the sunlight, threatening to choke out the slow-growing flowers. If you want to maintain the specific, harmonious design of the garden you originally planned, you must take out your shears, periodically trim back the aggressive hedges, and clear space to allow the flowers to thrive.
So rebalancing a financial portfolio works via the exact same mechanical logic.
Yes, if your high-risk technology stocks have a massive, record-breaking year and grow so fast that they suddenly dominate 70% of your portfolio, instead of the intended 50%, your variance has dangerously increased.
The garden is overgrown.
Exactly. So the robo-advisor automatically trims the hedges. It sells a portion of those winning tech stocks, locking in the gains, and uses that cash to buy more of your underperforming bonds. It forces your overall risk profile back to its intended, mathematically optimal spot on the efficient frontier.
It takes the emotion completely out of it.
It does. And that brings us to the most powerful, practical takeaway for anyone navigating their own wealth. It's a concept often referred to as naive diversification.
Naive diversification, meaning you don't need to be a math genius.
Right. You do not need a liquid-cooled supercomputer running quadratic programming algorithms in your basement. You do not need to construct a matrix of 2 million pairwise covariances. Simply spreading your capital broadly across massive, mostly uncorrelated asset classes captures almost the entirety of the theoretical free lunch.
By holding domestic equities, international equities, and high-quality government and corporate bonds, you naturally pair the umbrellas with the sunscreens on a macroeconomic scale.
Yes. You structurally insulate your wealth against localized regional downturns and sector-specific collapses.
And critically, by relying on broad index funds to achieve this naive diversification, you protect yourself from the mathematical traps of the error maximizer, because you are not asking an algorithm to bet heavily on tiny historical data anomalies.
Exactly. But implementing this requires the most profound psychological shift a successful investor can make. The true enduring legacy of Harry Markowitz is not the specific algebra of quadratic programming, it is the fundamental framework of how to think about capital.
Because an amateur investor looks at a financial asset, reads a news story about it, and asks, is this a good stock? Will it go up? They isolate the asset, they evaluate its individual variance, its individual dividend yield, its individual corporate narrative.
Markowitz mathematically proved that evaluating a stock in isolation is entirely the wrong question.
So what is the right question?
The right question, the only question that matters for long-term survival, is, does this asset make my entire portfolio better or worse?
Because of how it interacts with everything else?
Yes. An asset that goes up less frequently, but reliably and stubbornly zigs when everything else in your portfolio zags, is infinitely more valuable to your financial survival than a highly profitable, good stock that moves in exact, terrifying lockstep with everything you already own.
That subtle mental shift changed how humanity views financial risk forever. I mean, what started as a highly technical, nearly rejected thesis in a tense Chicago seminar room transformed over decades into a universal law of financial physics.
It's remarkable. We evolved from a world where risk was a vague, unquantifiable feeling managed by folk wisdom to a world where risk is a rigorously managed, perfectly balanced mathematical equation. Markowitz proved that the global market actually pays you in the form of preserved capital and drastically reduced volatility simply for recognizing the mathematical reality that not everything moves together at the same time.
While we must always acknowledge that the pure mathematical machine has severe limits, that historical data is flawed, and that covariances can violently break down in catastrophic, fat-tailed moments, the core insight undeniably changed the trajectory of global wealth creation.
It took common sense, stripped away the emotion, and gave it a permanent structural foundation.
It serves as a permanent reminder that sometimes the most profound, world-altering discoveries emerge not from inventing a radical new asset, but from finally recognizing the invisible, stabilizing relationships between the assets we already hold.
Diversification remains the only true free lunch in investing, because the market pays you simply for holding the umbrella and the sunscreen.
This is the Research Desk, officially signing off.